So hi, my name is Schöndorf. Until last July, I was the Deputy Attorney General for International Law here in Israel, with responsibility to various national security and foreign affairs issues, which I think might affect a little bit some of the comments I make here. I would say I think these are very important issues. I thought so also when I was in office, and for that reason I actually established within the Ministry of Justice in Israel an office for international technology law, that I'm happy to see some of the colleagues from this office present here. Exactly with the view to follow and also participate in the international conversation about regulation of various types of technology, which I think is going to be very significant in the coming decade. I also had the honor of giving the policy speech on behalf of the State of Israel on its policies in the cyber sphere. Similar speeches were given by senior officials of other governments, including many now, but certainly United States, the UK, France, and many others. And those of you that are interested in the government policy of Israel, I think there are some interesting points there that are also related to offensive use of cyber. I'm saying all of this to stress that today I'm not anymore part of the Israeli government, and therefore the things I'm going to say today do not represent in any way the views of the government. And if I could guess, I think on some issues they may not just technically not represent the views of the government. These are really my own views, and please take them as such. So Niva and Amit, thank you for inviting me, asked me to speak a little bit about some of the policy issues that come up in this context. I was allocated 10 minutes for this task, which is certainly challenging. I will try to do my best. It will be somewhat short, but I hope I will be able to identify some of the key issues, and then later on we can develop them further, maybe in the discussion. So I think the first most obvious issue, right, is of policy here, is that we need to strike some balance between privacy and other interests that relate to national security or public security and safety. And this is quite obvious, so you don't need to say that much about it. But obviously each one of us really cares about our own privacy. We don't want people sniffing in our mails or knowing where we are at every particular moment. But on the other hand, we don't want to have these spaces of impunity where terrorists or criminals can feel very safe to communicate and operate and plan their criminal or terrorist activity. And I think if one, not to take anything from the importance of privacy, I think if one puts to the public the question of, where would you put the balance, I think most people, certainly here in Israel, but I think this will be true also in other countries, will say, well, I am willing to tolerate the idea that in some circumstances, in order to prevent a terrorist activity, in order to fight criminal networks, that there will be this possibility of an expansion in some way of wiretapping. And certainly I'm of the view that in our world, the way the world developed with the technological capabilities that exist today, it's impossible, it's not realistic to have a world where we will not have these tools for these very limited and legitimate purposes. And I think that, you know, once people accept, and I think that Natalie's presentation was very good in that, you know, even the UN officials that are responsible for, in a way, for human rights do not say we want a complete ban. There are people that hold this view. I think they are today a minority, and I think in some ways this battle has already been settled. Obviously, if one thinks that that we should have some version of these tools available, who should have these tools available to him? Clearly, I don't think here again there will be any question that it is the government, right? That in some way it will be the government that will have these tools to infiltrate into our personal phones, right? We don't want this to be some sort of private entity. We want the government with its responsibility and accountability to be to have this role. But there, I think it begins to be a bit more complicated. If the government has it, who in government should have these powers, and which conditions that the government can actually go into or invade our privacy. And obviously, if we go outside of the national government, right, to the international sphere, which governments do we agree that every government should have this sort of tools available to it, or should there be some limitations? Now, you know, it's very easy to respond to this and say, yes, we only want governments that meet the highest standards of a liberal democracy with courts. But obviously, it's not that simple, because what happens if countries that do not have these kinds of maybe guarantees develop these tools themselves, right? Is it realistic to say that international law prohibits them from developing these tools? Maybe we can say it in some legalistic way, but I'm not sure that it's going to prevent these countries from having them. In the same way that we were unable to prevent the production of weapons or the development of weapons by countries until today, and also the export and sale of weapons between countries. So I think there is a complex relationship there between what one might aspire and the realities of the international politics and what can be achieved in terms of regulation and legislation within the international community as a whole. Obviously, if the entire international community is not part to a regulation, then different types of dilemmas come up, right? Because then every limitation that a group of countries takes upon itself, right, is just limiting its capabilities in sometimes fighting against some of these others that are not willing to take upon themselves any limitations. And that, of course, complicates things as well. To move on, the next area, I think, that raises interesting policy questions is the relationship between the governments and the private sector. Here, the private sector of those that produce these technologies, technologies of offensive cyber capabilities. One could take the view and say, well, you know, okay, this is something that we understand that governments need, but only governments will be allowed to develop these technologies. I think this model realistically doesn't stand. I think there are certain advantages to the private sector in developing technology, and the attempts to prevent a private sector from developing technologies, I think, have consistently failed throughout the history. So I don't think it's realistic, and I think that eventually we will have, you know, if we are to have these sort of technologies, we will have a segment in the private sector that develops them. It may be regulated, it may be limited in what it can do or cannot do, but I don't think we can exclude that. And then if we accept that there needs to be that segment in the private sector, we also need to make sure that we do not create an atmosphere that turns this group of people in the private sector to some sort of mercenaries. I hope it's fine. So those of you that follow some of Microsoft's press releases or comments. So we need to accept it, that this is part of, like other types of people that create things that could be used in a bad way and could be used in a positive way. And as long as eventually the regulation is in the right place, also those people that do that should not be labeled as bad people, and they should also not be the victims of not being able to reach the governments, right? So we see these lawsuits in the United States against NSO and other corporations that at the end of the day, they target the industry, right? As a whole, they target they target the inability to target the government action, the inappropriate government action, with no recourse. So you go to those that produced or created this. Now it may or may not be that they have some fault of their own as well, but I think in an ideal world we don't want to see that, right? We don't want to see, we want the regulation to be such that those that develop the technology know what they can and cannot do, and then they also cannot be sued for then the things that governments do. In some ways, in a similar way that it is with weapons today, right? You cannot sue the producer of weapons that the United States sold later on to, let's say, Saudi Arabia. Cannot be sued for some sort of use of by Saudi Arabia. And I think that the current regime, the lack of clarity in the current regime, is doing some injustice at the end of the day to those parts in the private sector. The next, I think, interesting policy questions are actually at the level of the platforms, the Microsofts and the others. And I think there. So there is a question in dealing with this. What is the relationship between the responsibilities of the governments and the responsibilities of the platforms to create a safe online sphere? And here, I see the eagerness in which the platforms are defending the privacy of their own of their users, and the extent to which they go to resist efforts to gain access to information there. And I think there is some thinking that needs to be done also on the side of the multinational corporations. Because in the first instance, I think these are actually the multinational corporations that created this risk to begin with, right? They benefit from it. They created these platforms, and on these platforms, there is a lot of positive activity happening, but also some of the bad activity is happening there, right? And as a result, the multinationals they profit a lot from the activity that also creates the risk. And in some ways there is even, I would say, some inconsistency in the idea. If you come to the platforms, as I did, and say, well, take responsibility for what is happening. If there was a terrorist attack that was orchestrated using the platform, you should be responsible. You should be responsible for it also. They would say, absolutely no, right? There is no way. They are fighting. The platforms are fighting it strongly. But in some ways, what are they saying to the NSOs of the world, right? The platforms are saying the same thing, right? You're creating a technology. You gave it to actors. Some actors use it positively. Some use it negatively. You should be responsible to what those that use it negatively do. So there is some conceptual tension there, and so I think that on the side of the platforms, the insistence on creating very high levels of encryption that even governments cannot encrypt, not giving the keys to the government, and making privacy of their users as a core principle, and not being part of the balance, actually in some ways creates this need to have tools that may be less consensual. And so when we look at the regulation, we need, I think, perhaps to look into this. And Kevin, of course, I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you will have things to say about this. This is not to say that the responsibility to dealing with the threats of terrorism and law enforcement can be somehow delegated to the corporations, right? At the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the government. And so in some instances, the government will need to penetrate into these systems in the same way that it does penetrate into the homes of individuals or people. I see that I'm way over time, so I will just identify two last points, and I will identify them in a sentence. One, I think there is tension also, or it's interesting to look into the tension also between, at the state level, between two groups of states. So one is the states that have the technology and the states that don't have the technology, right? So when you come to try and regulate technology, you always have these states that have less capabilities, that many times are larger in number, trying to limit the ability to use or develop the technology by the other states, by the few states that have the capability, as part of a power struggle, right? So, and obviously that raises the question whether this is really the best way to, whether the best way to regulate is actually by counting votes of states in the international community. But here there is an additional tension that is interesting, and this is the tension between the countries that have the technological ability, right? Because even within these countries, it's not clear that there isn't competition between the different services of these countries about who will have the better ability, the better access, and also their willingness to share with each other is not always 100%, because either whether they trust one another or compete with one another. And I think this also, this fragmentation also within the community of those that have the capabilities, I think creates also some challenges to the regulation and brings interests into the regulation that may not be interests of the general international community, but of specific of specific elements in the community that have power or want to preserve power. The last point is that there is a challenge of actually, this is for you. There is a challenge of actually having an open debate about these issues, an open and informed debate about these issues with the general public, because some of these capabilities are very sensitive, and governments, I think, naturally don't want to share the fact that they have these capabilities, or even that they are interested in these capabilities, or and certainly what the type of capabilities are, and also what the conditions for using these capabilities are, because if you share them, then those on the other side will be able to use them. On the other hand, when you don't share them, that creates a lot of mistrust with the public, right? People think, oh, if you are hiding, that's clearly because you are doing horrible things and using and abusing these tools in a terrible way. And so there is a challenge here how to balance between these two. I can tell you that there is at least within Western liberal countries, certainly in Israel, there is a lot of thinking that goes into how to use, why to use. It's not just you have the tool, okay, like we had in the example of Ronen Bergman, the president wakes in the morning, or the prime minister says, oh, why don't we go and listen to that, or bug that person, and it happens. It doesn't work like that. It's much more sophisticated and well thought of. But obviously, things that happen behind closed doors, they have the risks of, or there is also a need to ask who supervises them to prevent abuse. All of this is just, kind of the very kind of basic, very superficial touch of a number of policy issues. I'm sure some of them will come up in the discussion. Thank you very much.